and welcome to the National Park of Apollonia, also known as the National Park of Arsuf. Why two different names, you wonder? Well, actually, maybe they're not that different, but I'll address that question shortly. Meanwhile, a word about our location. We are on the coastal plain of the land of Israel. You can clearly see the Mediterranean Sea behind my back, and some of the ancient remains from the Roman period behind my back too, down there. And we're located to the north of Tel Aviv and south of Netanya, next to a city called Herzliya. Now, here there's a beautiful national park, including a magnificent castle or fortress built by the Crusaders. And that's what we're going to explore shortly. But let's get back for a moment to the question of the name of the site. This is an archaeological site. And the question, of course, is how do we know it's either Apollonia or Arsuf, and where did these names come from? Have we found an inscription, perhaps, stating that this place is called Apollonia or Arsuf? Well, no, unfortunately, this is not the case. But we have something else. We actually have a later copy, medieval copy, of an ancient Roman map from the 3rd century describing the roads in the Roman Empire, including the land of Israel, which used to be back then part of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. And on that map, when we look at the region where we are now, we see that there's a city called Apollonia. But where did the name Apollonia come from? Unfortunately, we do not have any records on that, but we may assume that it is named after the pagan god Apollo. Mind you, this is the Roman period, and people back then believed in the gods, Apollo, Jupiter, Venus, Aphrodite, and so on and so forth. So Apollo, the god of the sun, light, and so on and so forth. And maybe there was a center of cult, a temple dedicated to Apollo here in Apollonia. So it makes perfect sense. But where did the name Arsuf come from? Well, to understand that, we need to go back in time, before the Romans, 2,500 years ago, actually, to the Persian era. In the 5th century BC, the land is controlled by the Persians. And the Persians, coming from Persia, are also pagans, and they control the entire region. Yet, there's a special group of people living in this site and in other coastal plain sites, and they're called the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians from Phoenicia, today present-day Lebanon, are a nation different than the Persians. So why are they residing here? Why are they living here? Not because the Persians were kind to them, but it all goes down to business. The Persians had an empire to run. They had enemies, but they did not have a navy. And if you wish to fight a sea in a battle, you need a navy, you need ships. The Phoenicians had ships. So the deal was that the Phoenicians will give the Persians their ships for their purposes, and of course they will also use it for trade. And the Persians, in return, will give them what they want. And what did they want? The coastal plain cities. Why? Because the Phoenicians are traders. But that's not the entire story. Yes, we do have here in Apollonia, we do have a little harbor. But that's not the main reason, I believe, why the Phoenicians wanted that place. They wanted Apollonia because next to the harbor, there's a large colony of sea snails. And sea snails are gold. In what sense? You can produce the purple dye from the sea snails, crushing them and using them to create one of the most expensive commodities in the ancient world, the purple dye. So the Phoenicians settle here. And we know that the Phoenicians were also pagans, and they had their own gods. One of their gods was called Reshef, or Rashap. And he's, again, a god of fire, of light, of sun. Actually, his name, Reshef, should be translated as spark of fire, spark of light. So we believe that what happened was that the original name of this site was probably Arshaf, Arshuf, something like that, based on the name of the ancient Phoenician god. When the Romans conquered the land in the 1st century BC, they turned it into Apollonia, so Reshef became Apollo, and Apollo gave the name Apollonia to the site. And many, many hundreds of years later, when the Muslim Arabs conquered the Holy Land in the 7th century, they revived the ancient name of Arshaf, Arshuf, and turned it into Arsuf. In the 11th century, when the Crusaders occupied the Holy Land, when they came here, and slightly later in 1101, when the Crusaders took over Arsuf or Arshuf, they pronounced the name slightly differently. They called it Arsur. So the names of this site are Arshaf or Arsuf, Apollonia, and, as the Crusaders called it, Arsur. This is the wall of Arsuf. Now, this is the wall built by the Crusaders after they conquered the city, but they built it on the core, on the former wall that was built by the Muslims. So basically, in 1099, when the Crusaders attacked the walls of Arsuf, they attacked this line of wall. The Crusader attack failed horridly. Why? Well, for a simple reason. Arsuf is located on the coastal plain, next to the sea. If the Crusaders wished to blockade the city, to lay siege to the city, they have to close it from the land side and also from the seaside. But they did not have the means for that, because the Crusaders did not have a navy, they did not have ships. The Muslims did. It means that even if the Crusaders lay siege to the city from the land side, the Muslims can still have support, they can have reinforcement, medicine and ammunition, and so on and so forth from the seaside. So the Crusaders realized they cannot take over the city. So they waited for a more suitable opportunity. Meanwhile, the locals have surrendered. They agreed to have a Crusader Christian governor. They agreed to pay taxes as long as the city remains theirs. In 1101, the Crusaders came back. It was obvious they cannot allow a Muslim city to continue to exist in the western border. So they came back and attacked the city, but this time they were much better prepared. Yes, the Crusaders did not have ships, but their allies, the merchants of Genova in Italy, they had ships. So they signed a contract, a treaty with the merchants of Genova. They supplied the Crusaders with ships, and now the siege was complete. And obviously, Arsuf fell to the hands of the Crusaders. In the beginning, the city was just a Crusader city surrounded by a wall. But in the 13th century, the Crusaders added something else. They added a fortress that was built on the western side of the city. So by the end of the 13th century, when there were great battles between the Crusaders and the Mamelukes, Arsuf looked quite similar to Caesarea. You see, there was the city surrounded by a wall, and at the edge, a large, formidable fortress. Let us now go and explore the fortress of Arsuf. We are now in the 13th century. It's the second Crusader kingdom, and by the middle of the 13th century, around the 1240s, the tension between the Crusader Christian kingdom and its enemies, the Muslims, the Ayyubids, in the south, in Egypt, and in the north, in Damascus, grew. As a result, fortresses, bigger than ever, were built in the Holy Land. The biggest of them all was the one in Sfat, where we're going to be later. But a smaller fortress was also built here, on the seashores of the land of Israel, in Arsuf. It was built, we believe, around the year 1241. How can we be so accurate? Obviously, due to the fact that we have written historical records mentioning that fortress around that year. Perhaps it was built a couple of years earlier, but probably not too long before. Now, the fortress stands here in 1241. For about 20 years, it is owned by the master, by the lord of Arsuf. But in 1261, the master of Arsuf, his name is Balian of Ibelin, decides that the political situation is too dangerous. He does not have the sufficient forces to defend Arsuf in case of a future attack. By the 1260s, by the beginning of the 1260s, it's still the Muslims that are the enemies, but they're no longer the Ayyubids, it's the Mamluks. And the Mamluks are led by several leaders, eventually by Baybars, the great general of the Mamluks. So by the 1260s, the situation, as I said, is more tensed and more dangerous. So the Lord of Arsuf decides to lease the fortress, basically to give it to the order of the Hospitallers, the military order, in return for a nice sum of 4,000 gold coins per year. And that was the case, that was the situation for the next 5 years, until in 1265, the final attack against Arsuf was launched by the Muslim general Baybars. When we look there, we can see behind me, we can see the fortress of Arsuf, but it looks very far away. There's a good reason for that. Between us in the city and the fortress over there, there's a huge moat, one of the biggest ever dug in the land of Israel. So obviously, when we look at the fortress, the first question we should ask is, how did they get there back then in the Crusader period? And the answer is quite simple. Look down into the moat, and what you see down there are the ruins of the foundations of a large bridge. That bridge no longer stands today, so what we need to do is to get into the fortress via the new route prepared for us by the Antiquities Authorities and the National Garden and Parks Authority. Let's go inside. I walked across the moat of the fortress of Arsuf, and now I'm standing in front of the main gate of the fortress. Now we can clearly see the passage immediately behind me. That's where the doors used to be. To the right and to the left are two round towers. But I can tell you much more about how that gate looked like during the 13th century, before it was destroyed by the Mamluks. The gate had two wooden doors, and they were divided into 4 sectors. And above that, if you approach the gate, you could see the main dungeon, or the donjon, the keep, the main tower of the fortress immediately behind my back. How do I know that? Because we have found the official seal of the Lord of Arsuf. His name was Balian I, and on his seal we can clearly see the doors, the sectors of which they are made, the round towers, the wall, and also the keep, the dungeon on top of that, which is actually behind the main entranceway. Around the seal, we can still read perfectly well. We can read "C'est le Chastier de Arsuf," meaning this is the fortress of Arsuf. So let's go into the fortress built in 1241. In the excavations of the fortress, the archaeologists have found numerous finds, some of them big, some of them small. One of the things they found here was the kitchen, including the ovens. Not far from the kitchen, we have found the dumping area where the garbage was thrown. And there we have found something of a great interest. We have found many vessels, broken kitchenware that were disposed, thrown away by the Crusader Hospitaller order. But one of them actually carried an inscription in Arabic mentioning the Sultan. Now, this is a very precious vessel, and the only examples that we have of such vessels come from the region of Syria, from the enemy's territories, meaning there was still commerce, and traders moved from the Crusader kingdom to the Muslim kingdoms, bringing goods, selling goods perhaps, and that's what we find here. Now that was a very precious and expensive kitchenware, along with kitchenware imported from the region of Italy. How did the Crusaders living here have the money, the funds, to buy such precious vessels? Well, we know that the members of the Order of St. John, or the Hospitaller Order, were poor by definition. But the order as an order was a very rich one. And they had treasures. For instance, in the excavations here at Arsuf, and unfortunately I can't tell you exactly where, but a treasure was found here. 108 gold dinars, gold coins. Now, this is a real fortune, because for 2 dinars, an entire family could live for an entire year. So, well, some of the coins here were a quarter of a dinar, not necessarily 1 dinar, but yet it is indeed a fortune. So that's how they bought what they needed. Think about the food they need, the horses, the supplies and everything. They had the money, and that money was basically the funds that they got from donations from Europe and wealthy people living in the Holy Land. Behind my back, we can see the place where the last defenders of Arsuf remained. This is the keep, this is the donjon, or the dungeon. And behind me, you can clearly see the arch of the window overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Let's climb the steps and take a look from the top of the dungeon and see what's hidden behind it on the cliff. Follow me. What a beautiful scene. We're looking down at the harbor of Arsuf. As you recall, already in the Phoenician period, there was a harbor here. Maybe that was part of the reason why the Phoenicians, 2,500 years ago, wanted to settle here at Arsuf. Now, with the Crusaders here, this is that little harbor. It's not too big. It's about 50 meters into the sea and about 100 meters long. So 2,500 square meters. That's it. It's a tiny one. And it may have housed about 6 or 7 or 8 ships. Not too many, but enough for the Crusaders to flee the destroyed city. In 1265, the city and the fortress are besieged by Baibars. The walls fall down, people are slaughtered, and the last defenders are here in the castle, in the fortress of Arsuf. Why didn't they escape? Why didn't they use their ships to sail away back home to Europe? Well, the reason was that when Baibars attacked the city and bombarded it, and later bombarded the fortress using heavy stones thrown by a long-range stone throwers called ballistas, and using large arrows made of iron attached to long rods of wood. When he used these weapons, it was quite clear that that's the end of the city. And the Crusaders negotiated with Baibars. For 40 days, he attacks the city and the fortress, and the Crusaders decide to suggest to him that they would surrender in return for their freedom. Baibars agrees. But once the city surrenders, Baibars doesn't live up to his word. Baibars takes them captives, and he makes the Crusaders destroy their own castle. That's why we see this destruction here today. But this is not the entire story. What we've studied in recent years, in the 20th and 21st centuries, about the 13th century, based on the written sources, based on the excavations of many sites, Crusader sites along the coastal plain, was that the destruction of Arsuf was not a lonely planet. It wasn't just Arsuf that was destroyed. It was a complete and systematic destruction of the entire coastal plain by the Mamluks. And there was a reason for that. You see, when Baybars took over the coastal plain, he had a problem. Baybars did not have a navy. The Mamluks did not have a navy. Yet the Christians in Europe did have navies. And he was so concerned that maybe sometime in the future, another crusade will reach the coastal plain, another crusade will come to the Holy Land. And if they invade the coastal plain and take over, because the Mamluks can't stop them at sea, it would be much harder to get rid of them next time. So Baybars' policy doomed the coastal plain region for the next couple of hundreds of years until the 19th century, except for exceptions such as Akko, which was reconstructed in the 18th century by Ahmad al-Jazar and perhaps a bit earlier by Daher al-Omar. The coastal plain cities and fortresses remained in ruins until in the 19th century the Zionist movement purchased these lands and established new settlements in the Holy Land.